The morning sun painted the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson as Iona knelt beside the stream, filling her water gourd with practiced silence. At 16, she moved with the fluid grace her grandmother had taught her, every gesture calculated to disturb neither the earth nor the spirits that dwelled within it. The Apache way demanded such reverence, and Iona had learned these lessons well during her years in the hidden canyon her people called home. Her long black hair caught the early light as she worked, braided with the traditional blue beads that marked her as unmarried. Soon, she knew, her father would begin entertaining offers from the young warriors who had begun to notice how she had grown from a gangly child into a woman. The thought both thrilled and frightened her, for marriage would mean leaving the protection of her father's lodge and beginning a new chapter of her life. A red-winged blackbird called from the mesquite bush nearby, its trill echoing off the canyon walls. Iona smiled, remembering her grandmother's stories about how the birds carried messages between the living and the spirit world. Her grandmother, Naeli, had been the tribe's medicine woman until her death 3 winters past, and Iona still felt her presence in moments like these, when the desert seemed to pulse with ancient wisdom. The sound of approaching hooves shattered the morning's tranquility like thunder splitting a clear sky. Iona's blood turned to ice as she recognized the unmistakable rhythm of shod horses, not the unshod ponies her people rode. White soldiers. The water gourd slipped from her fingers, sending ripples across the stream's surface as she pressed herself against the rocky outcropping, hoping to remain invisible. Through a gap in the stones, she watched in horror as a column of blue-uniformed cavalry emerged from the canyon's mouth, their brass buttons gleaming in the sunlight. At their head rode a man with cruel eyes and a thin mustache, his face weathered by years under the desert sun. Behind him came 30 more soldiers, their rifles ready, their faces grim with purpose. Iona's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what this meant. Her people's secret sanctuary, hidden for generations in the twisting maze of canyons and mesas, had been discovered. Somehow, the white soldiers had found their way through the ancient passages that only the Apache knew, following trails that should have been invisible to their untrained eyes. The attack began without warning. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as more soldiers appeared on the canyon rim, their positions suggesting this was a carefully planned assault. Iona pressed her hands to her ears, but she could not block out the terrifying sounds of battle. The crack of rifles, the screams of horses, the war cries of her people mixed with the shouts of soldiers. From her hiding place, she watched her world collapse. Her father, Chaitin, emerged from their family's wickiup with his rifle in hand, his face painted for war. He had been a feared warrior in his youth, before the tribe had been forced into hiding, and now he fought with the desperate courage of a man defending all he held dear. But there were too many soldiers, and they had the advantage of surprise and superior weapons. Iona saw her mother, Eatsell, running toward the horses with her younger brother Nailnish clutched in her arms. The boy was only 8, too young to understand the magnitude of what was happening, but old enough to be terrified by the chaos around him. A soldier's bullet found Eatsell as she reached for her pony's reins, and Iona watched in helpless agony as her mother fell, shielding Nailnish with her body even as her own life ebbed away. The battle was brief but devastating. The Apache, caught unprepared and outnumbered, could not mount an effective defense. One by one, Iona watched the warriors fall. Her uncle Kuruk, who had taught her to track deer, old Ahiga, the storyteller who kept the tribe's history alive in his memory, young Takota, who had been planning to ask her father for permission to court her. When the gunfire finally ceased, an eerie silence settled over the canyon. Iona remained frozen in her hiding place, afraid to breathe, afraid to move, afraid to discover the full extent of the tragedy that had befallen her people. Through the gap in the rocks, she could see bodies scattered across the ground like broken dolls, their bright clothing now stained with blood and dirt. The soldier with the mustache dismounted and walked among the fallen, checking each body with cold efficiency. When he reached Ayana's father, Chayton was still breathing, though a spreading red stain across his chest told of a mortal wound. The soldier knelt beside him and spoke in accented Spanish, a language Ayana understood from trade encounters with Mexican merchants. "Where are the others?" the soldier demanded. "We know this isn't your whole tribe." Chayton's response was to spit blood in the soldier's face. The man wiped it away calmly and stood, drawing his pistol. Stubborn to the end, he muttered and fired a single shot. Ayana bit her fist to keep from crying out, tasting her own blood as her teeth broke the skin. Her father, the strongest man she had ever known, lay still beneath the merciless sun. The soldier holstered his weapon and called to his men, "Search everywhere. Check every cave, every overhang. There might be survivors." Terror gave Ayana's muscles new strength, and she pressed herself deeper into the crevice between the rocks. She could hear the soldiers spreading out through the canyon, their heavy boots crunching on the gravel, their voices growing closer. One passed directly in front of her hiding place, so close she could smell the leather and sweat and gunpowder that clung to his uniform. "Nothing here, Captain," the soldier called, and moved on. Hours passed like days as Ayana remained hidden, listening to the soldiers methodically destroy everything her people had built. They burned the wiki-ups, scattered the carefully stored food supplies, and drove away the horses that had survived the initial assault. The smoke from the burning homes filled the canyon, making Ayana's eyes water and her throat burn, but she dared not cough or move. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the canyon floor, the captain called his men to assemble. "We'll camp here tonight," he announced. "Tomorrow we'll search the surrounding canyons. There are more of them out there, and we're going to find every last one." The soldiers made their camp in the center of the canyon, using the scattered belongings of Ayana's people to fuel their fires. She watched them sit around the flames, eating army rations and drinking coffee from metal cups, laughing and talking as if they hadn't just destroyed an entire community. Their casual indifference to the massacre they had committed filled her with a rage so pure and hot it threatened to consume her from within. Night fell with agonizing slowness. Ayana's muscles cramped from hours of remaining motionless, but she forced herself to stay hidden until she was certain the soldiers were asleep. When the last sentry had settled into his post, and the camp had grown quiet except for the occasional snore or shifting of blankets, she finally allowed herself to move. Every joint protested as she crawled from her hiding place, but she ignored the pain. Moving like a shadow, she crept through the canyon, checking each fallen body in the desperate hope of finding someone, anyone, who had survived. But the soldiers had been thorough in their work. Her people were gone, all of them, their spirits now walking the star trail to the land of their ancestors. She found Nailnish's small body beside their mother, and her heart shattered completely. The little boy who had loved to chase lizards and collect smooth stones was gone, his dark eyes staring sightlessly at the stars their grandmother had taught them to name. Ayana closed his eyes gently and whispered the prayers Naeli had taught her, asking the spirits to guide him safely to the next world. The practical side of her mind, the part that had been trained to survive in the harsh desert, told her she needed supplies if she hoped to escape. Moving carefully to avoid the sleeping soldiers, she gathered what she could from the scattered remains of her home. A water gourd that had miraculously survived the destruction, a pouch of pemmican that had been overlooked by the soldiers, her grandmother's medicine bag with its precious herbs and charms, and her father's skinning knife. She also took something else, the soldier captain's map, which she found folded in his saddlebag. Though she could not read the strange marks and symbols the white men used, she recognized some of the landmarks drawn upon it, and she understood that this paper had led the soldiers to her people's sanctuary. As she prepared to leave the only home she had ever known, Ayana paused at her grandmother's grave. The soldiers had not disturbed the burial mound, perhaps not recognizing it for what it was, and She pressed her palm against the earth that covered Naeli's remains. "Guide me, grandmother," she whispered in the Apache tongue. "Show me how to survive when all hope is lost." The wind picked up, stirring the ashes of the burned wickiups and carrying with it the scent of sage and desert flowers. For a moment, Ayana could almost hear her grandmother's voice in the sound, offering comfort and strength for the journey ahead. She turned away from the destroyed village and began walking toward the canyon's eastern rim, where ancient trails led into the deep desert. Behind her, the soldiers slept peacefully beside their fires, unaware that they had left a witness to their crimes. They had destroyed her people, but they had not destroyed her, and as long as she lived, the memory of what they had done would live as well. The climb to the canyon rim was treacherous in the darkness, but Ayana had made this journey many times during her childhood adventures. Her hands found the familiar handholds in the rock face, and her feet unerringly discovered the narrow ledges that would support her weight. The physical challenge helped focus her mind, giving her something concrete to accomplish while her heart struggled to process the enormity of her loss. When she reached the top, she paused to look back one final time at the canyon that had been her world. The soldiers' fires looked like fallen stars scattered across the floor, and the silence was so complete she could almost convince herself that nothing had changed, that she would wake tomorrow to find this had all been a terrible dream. But the smoke still rose from the ashes of her home, and the bodies of her family still lay beneath the indifferent stars. This was no dream, no vision sent by the spirits to test her faith. This was the new reality she would have to navigate if she hoped to survive. Ayana turned eastward, toward the trackless wastes where few white men dared to venture, and began walking. The desert stretched endlessly before her, a sea of sand and stone beneath the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, if the stories were true, other Apache bands still roamed free, still fought to preserve their way of life against the encroaching tide of settlers and soldiers. She would find them, she promised herself. She would warn them of the soldiers' plans and help them prepare for the battles to come. And someday, when she was strong enough and skilled enough, she would return to face the men who had destroyed her family. Her grandmother's spirits would guide her, and her father's courage would sustain her, and the love her mother had died protecting would give her the strength to endure whatever trials lay ahead. The night was cold, but Ayana did not shiver. The fire that burned within her heart was enough to keep the chill at bay, and it would continue burning as long as she drew breath. She was the last witness to her people's destruction, the final keeper of their memory, and she would not let their sacrifice be forgotten. As dawn approached, painting the eastern horizon with pale light, Ayana quickened her pace. The soldiers would wake soon and discover that their massacre had not been as complete as they believed. They would search for her, she knew, and when they failed to find her, they would spread word that a survivor had escaped. But the desert was vast, and she was Apache. She knew how to read the signs in wind and stone, how to find water where others saw only barren sand, how to move without leaving tracks for enemies to follow. The white soldiers had destroyed her village, but they had not destroyed her spirit, and in the end, that might prove to be their greatest mistake. The rising sun painted her shadow long across the desert floor as she walked toward an uncertain future, carrying with her the weight of her people's memory and the unbreakable determination to survive. The desert became Ayana's world, vast and unforgiving yet strangely protective in its emptiness. For 3 weeks, she moved like a ghost across the landscape, following game trails and dry riverbeds, always staying ahead of the cavalry patrols she sometimes glimpsed in the distance. Her grandmother's teachings sustained her. How to find water by watching the flight patterns of birds, how to identify edible plants among the thorny scrub, how to create shelter from sun and wind using only stones and brush. The stolen map proved invaluable, though not in ways the soldier captain had intended. By studying the